GMTs are attention grabbers, and it's hard not to notice them with their vibrant bezel combinations. But what if that's not what you want? What if you wanted something a little more subtle? Maybe a little more tactical? Or maybe more tacti-cool? But either way, this is the one to check out. It's the 39mm Vaer G5 GMT tactical version, complete with a sleek blacked out PVD coated case. Then throw in a classic dial design, a variety of quick release straps and bracelets, a ton of LUME, as well as the newer Miota 9075 GMT movement. And despite a couple of glaring issues we'll also talk about, this one still winds up being one of the sleekest and subtlest Traveler's GMTs around. Before we dive into all of that, one quick disclaimer, and that's that Vaer provided this watch and they're not asking for it back, hence the promotional tag at the beginning. Now, that said, let's talk about the G5 Tactical, and we might as well start off with a case. If you're familiar with Vaer's other divers, then you'll know this case. It's one I'm a big fan of, which combines a brushed side, brushed top with long sweeping polished chamfers, leading right into a set of twisted lugs. It's a little bit easier to see on the steel version than this one, but it still comes across as a great looking case. One that comes across as maybe a bit Aquaterra or Planet Ocean-y, just thanks to the twisted lugs. Topping everything off, this stealthy case also has a fully lumed black ceramic bezel. While the case here is 39, the bezel is a tad wider at 40, making it just a little bit easier to get a hold of and use. Now it's bidirectional, 120 click, no backplay, as well as a great action, so all the good stuff here. Perhaps one of the better bidirectional actions I've run across, with a good amount of grip and a great clicky response. There's also the signed screw down crown, as well as an exhibition case back where you can see the movement, which winds up looking a little bit odd seeing a steel movement surrounded by all the black PVD. But I don't think Miota has a black tactical version yet, or ever will. And topping everything off is a double domed crystal with a ton of AR. And we'll come back to this crystal in a little bit because this is where some of those issues lie. And I want to see if you guys notice it before I bring it up. But underneath the crystal, there's also a great looking dial. On this version, the base is a very satiny, very subtle sunburst black. On the very outer edge, there's a chapter ring complete with minute markers painted in white. They're small, yet still fairly easy to read. Now, I know some of you would prefer it if these were 24-hour markings instead of minute, just so that you can track a third time zone more easily. And if that is you, comment down below. I want to know your thoughts. But for me, I'm actually okay not having it, and I prefer these minute markers. Because as long as I've had GMTs, I've never actually needed to do that with a third time zone. And I actually like having the minute markers here because I think it's a bit easier to read. As well as it brings some completeness to the design, since those minute markers would normally be on the bezel. But here, it's a GMT bezel. So, like I said, I like it, but maybe that's just me. Just inside that, you do have the applied indices, a combination of dots and dashes, each with a ton of white luminous paint surrounded by a flat brushed metal frame. Somewhat of a simple design, and I think one that's more reflective of a tool watch, as it's not flashy and the brushed framing contrasts with the sunburst black, making them much easier to read, even before you get to the white centers. Then there are also the hands, which match the indices, meaning they're also flat, also brushed, and also have a ton of lume. Well, the hour and minute hand are. The second hand is all in white, while the GMT is red, both of which stand out brilliantly against the black dial. We also can't forget the logo at the top, the standard text at the bottom, and bonus points here for a nice symmetric date at the 6 with a color matched date wheel. Overall, it's a good design, one that feels a little classic and perhaps familiar, yet not quite like any specific watch you've seen before. It's clean and easy to make out with good proportions, where the hands are exactly where they're supposed to be lengthwise. And while some, especially if you prefer a more flashy dial design, will think this is a little bit boring, I think you gotta understand that's the whole point. It's a stealthed out tool watch. The whole point of it is to be readable and not draw attention. And in that way, I gotta say it's a rather good looking watch. One that you could admire its subtlety. There's a lot going on, as there are in most GMTs, but this one somehow seems more cleaner and maybe more organized, just with that simple black and white color scheme. And I'm not sure I should mention this, but there is one thing that kind of made me chuckle with the water resistance on the dial. If you didn't catch it before, this watch, as many in Vaer's catalog, is American assembled. Basically, parts of it were imported in, and then the watch is put together here. And while in many other countries that would qualify for made in status, the United States is much stricter about requirements, hence, here it's assembled. But you can kind of think of it as equivalent to that. And I should also point out that there's also another version that's Swiss made, which comes with a Solida's Collars GMT movement. Anyway, back to the water resistance here. Now, even though I know this formatting is standard for water resistance a la Rolex, I still thought it was funny to see feet come before meters on an American watch. As a scientist, I completely agree metric is better, but we're still not converting over. Anyway, let's talk about LUME, because LUME here is great. Vaer lists this one as having 25 layers of X1 grade superluminova, and it shows. Now, this isn't the best watch I've ever seen when it comes to LUME. It's not quite King of LUME worthy, as I did put it up against one of Wise's divers. And it comes pretty close, but doesn't quite keep up. But as it stands, it's still fantastic and better than almost anything else out there. And definitely the best GMT I've seen so far. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to quickly talk about the specs again, because that does lead into my next two topics. The watch here is a 39 millimeters with a lug-to-lug of 46.5, which does sound like an ideal size for most. In fact, it is pretty comfortable on my 7¼ inch wrist. But it is a little bit top heavy with a thickness of 15.5 and a total weight of 110 grams on its rubber strap. On its bracelet, it might feel a little bit better, but I didn't get a chance to try that one out. I just got to try it on a few of their straps, all of which were great, with my favorite being the black Horween leather, followed by the Tropic rubber. Lug width here is 20 millimeters, so you got plenty of other option if you don't like Vaer's. Water resistance is a standard 200 meters, and it is using the Miyota 9075 True or Traveler's GMT movement, the one with the jumping hour hand. Same as this Jack Mason I'm wearing here, and if you're actually traveling, I think it is the preferred GMT movement. But if you're more just wanting to keep track of another time zone at home, honestly, a Collars GMT like the Solitas or an NH34 is probably the better choice. Price may also be a little bit high here, starting at $799 US. But the thing is, 9075s right now are just all over the map. And I think when you throw in the American assembled parts, it seems to be pretty par for the course when it comes to price. Now, let's talk about those two issues, and if you guessed what they were, mention it down below. But let's first talk about the total thickness here of 15.5. As for me, a good traveling watch is one that's thin enough to wear with anything, any time of year, including winter, and 15.5 is a tad tall for that, to put it mildly. So this isn't good, but it's also not quite as bad as it sounds. You see, because most of the 9075s out there are pretty tall. We're talking at least 14.5, if not 15.5. And to be clear, we're talking about with the crystal, which is often not listed in the specs, but really should be. Either way, they're all mostly tall, and I think that has something to do with the movement. However, where things get confusing is that they're not all that tall. There's a few brands like Traska and Jack Mason that have theirs just a little bit thinner, like down to 13.5 or even 13 millimeters. So the G5 here isn't alone when it comes to that height, and it's with some decent company. But I think whatever Jack Mason's doing and Traska's doing, other companies need to pay attention to get their thickness down. Because at the end of the day, this is a travel watch. That's really what you do with a GMT, and thinner is better. And the last issue we're going to talk about is where that whole glaring comment came in. But it's not so much glare as reflection. And that's because domed crystals reflect. You can't really get away from that. And some reflect more than others. And this one seems to reflect a lot. And it's not from a lack of AR, I can tell you that. Because most of the time the reflections I'm seeing have a really blue hue to them. So I think it's got plenty of AR. Now, Vaer loves their domed crystals, and I'm trying to be fair with this one to see if it's really any worse than any other domed crystal. So I wound up doing this little bit of a test, just to see how harshly I should judge it, where I walked around with it, my Jack Mason Stratotimer, which has a box cut crystal, and my new Citizen Chronomaster, which also has a nice domed crystal. So you can just kind of watch this and judge for yourself as I talk. It's still mostly livable, but I think the G5 does come across a little worse out of the three. The Stratotimer with its box cut crystal seems to be more glary than reflective, while the Chronomaster still has a bit of reflection, but it's not quite as magnified as the Vaer. Honestly, from what I've seen wearing this watch around, I'd say 45% of the time you won't even notice it. Whereas 45% of the time you'll notice it, but it's still very usable. Yet, there's that last 10% that can be completely annoying. I think it's more of an issue if you're in a darker area and there are just bright lights directly behind you. Because if there's lights around, this crystal's going to find it. Although, ironically, the crystal is beautifully clear at most off angles, like when you just sort of twist your wrist here to see it. But at the wrong time, wrong place, look straight down at it, and you get this, which is distracting to say the least. Bottom line, the G5 GMT has the potential to be one of the best 9075 GMTs out there. With its comfortable, sleek case, classic dial design, fantastic LUME, and with this tactical version in particular, it winds up being one of the more interesting GMT options out there. But there are two things holding it back, both relating to its crystal: the reflection and it being a bit thick. And as more and more 9075s start to hit the market, you need to consider every aspect of each watch when you're thinking about buying one. And both of these do hurt it a little bit. Now, like I said before, Vaer seems to use really high domed crystals on everything. They just love it. But I'd love it if they changed things up a little bit. Or maybe just wind up making a field watch GMT based on some of their other watches. At this point, there are a ton of diverse GMTs out there, but not quite as many fields. And I think with their catalog, they could do something really killer. But in the meantime, let me know your thoughts on this one, as well as what's your favorite GMT currently out there. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, do something down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.